Welcome to another episode of the Information Addicts Podcast. My name's Cassidy. I'm an information addict, and this is my podcast where I explore information, ideas, and beliefs and try to do those things more responsibly. Today, I have a conversation for you from Paul Klay. I've talked about Paul a little bit on this channel, and for a lot of you who watch me, you probably know Paul, but Paul is a YouTube person. He also is a Christian Reformed minister in Sacramento, and through my engagement with his resources and the things he's created through new media, I've gained a lot from it, and I credit a lot of what he does to helping me get where I am here. I probably still would have done something like this if it wasn't for him, but with his help and the resources that he's provided, it's definitely shaped the path that I've gone and really defined what I do here. So today I asked him to come on and have a conversation about his project and the importance of honest conversations and why he does that in the public space. As we talked, the conversation sort of went into different ways. We talked a little bit about racism and how those conversations are happening, a little bit about The Bachelor. We talked about status and morality and how those things play together. And I really enjoyed it and thought it was a great conversation. So I'm happy to share it with you. So without further ado, here is Paul Klay. Well, hi, Paul. Welcome to the channel.
Thank you, Cassidy. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, it's so good to have you on. I've been wanting you on for a while, but just waiting for the right time. But here you are. So why don't you give a brief explanation of who you are for people who don't know you?
Okay. My name is Paul Klay. I'm the pastor of Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church in Sacramento, California. I've been here for, it'll be 24 years this year in Sacramento. I got to know Cassidy after I got to know a whole lot more people when I started making YouTube videos about Jordan Peterson and the issues around, I think, some of the things that Jordan Peterson showed us about faith outside an insular church culture. And so it started out, I saw Jordan Peterson doing some interesting things. I saw he was attracting a following, and I wanted to know more about that. So I made some commentary videos on his videos, and then people started approaching me to talk to me about it and to tell me their stories. So I began posting those videos, and the thing has continued to grow. And so we started local meetups, and the people around here were so excited about the local meetups. They were interested in facilitating other people to start meetups. And so it has continued to grow since then to the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, which is a community of sorts around my channel and similar conversations. And that's kind of how I got where I am right now.
Yeah. So like you said, you do these Jordan Peterson commentaries and honestly commentaries on a lot of things in broader culture, but
Yeah.
there's a big part of your channel that's just having conversation with randos.
Yep.
How weird is that for you that there's all of these people on the internet who come to your channel to listen to you talk with people about like random things?
I think it is weird that as many people listen as they do. So I'm a pastor and I talk to people for a living. And so what I do on my channel is just sort of what I've always done. But that it's recorded and people watch it, that's the rather strange part. But it doesn't, it makes sense to me because people are naturally curious about other people. For example, my mother doesn't watch any of my commentary videos about Jordan Peterson, doesn't watch any of my monologue videos about what I'm thinking about. Just like, yeah. But when I'm talking to a random person and there's at least some reason to believe there might be something interesting in the conversation, she'll listen to that. Also partly because I do, for my own sake and the sake of the audience, usually ask people to get into their story a little bit.
Mhm.
Because I think we hear and see each other in the resonance of other people telling their stories. And we learn a lot of what I've learned over the last 3 years is that there's a great hunger for wisdom. And we do pick up wisdom by watching and listening to other people. And so I think people listen to my channel to gain wisdom. They're looking for other people who've had similar experiences and who have maybe not found an answer or a definitive answer, but just at least just a little bit of help to figure out what more they need in life.
Right. So how often do people let you release their conversations that you have with them? Is it sort of 50-50?
It was 50-50 when I started. Now I haven't been doing as many conversations lately. I get so many requests for conversations now that it didn't seem right to just say no to everyone or use the rando function that I made with Calendly and a link for everyone. So I still do that, but then there are other people who beg me, and so I'll say yes. And so then and I just look at my week, how much time do I have in any given week for a new conversation? Because partly every new conversation is potentially a new relationship. And there's that Dunbar number that I can only manage a certain number of relationships. So the
Right.
larger my channel gets, the more people want to get on, even just for the promotion of an idea or for some other reason. And that's valid too. So I'm always trying to balance that.
Yeah. So, a couple months back, you made a video about having honest conversations. And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because I think there is something, especially in the space where I find myself, where there's a need and a want for honest conversations. And I think a lot of people are struggling to figure out how to do that. So what do you see this project that you've done? Uh, how do you see it helping you get closer to having honest conversations?
I think it's important to begin by asking why we're struggling with honesty right now. As a culture, we I was watching a video. I was watching Bill Burr is a comedian, and
Hmm.
he was making a point about the fact that he can't watch sports anymore without everybody using a sporting event to promote some moral agenda.
Hmm.
And he said, if I'm watching a ball game with someone, I don't pause the ball game and start talking to someone about cancer or that I was abused as a child or, nothing like that. It's a ball game. Enjoy the ball game. And this morning I opened up PowerPoint because I was making a video, and right there, celebrate Women's Month, just banner ad right on the top within PowerPoint. And it's like, is no place safe from some agenda? And they're not even bad agendas. I mean, who is not against cancer? Everyone should be against cancer. But everything now, so many things have simply become the opportunity to propagate some moral agenda. And this is not, anybody who is a part of a Christian community should know this, because we have been propagandizing each other on how many different levels for how long. And so within a church community, it's long been known that there are certain things that you say and certain things that you don't say, or you will lose status.
Right.
And that's a natural part of human community. And so we all tend to wear masks and edit our conversation and do these things. And that's okay to a degree. But I think the culture is getting increasingly tyrannical with respect to these things. And what that means is that people are unable to discuss what they really think and feel for fear of being ostracized. Now, again, in a small community, let's say, I grew up outside of New York City, people were Yankee fans, a Boston Red Sox fan comes into your midst and we can't talk to him because he's a Red Sox fan. Okay, but that's a little cloistered thing.
Hmm.
What happens when the entire community can no longer process important moral discussions because too much stuff is blasphemy?
Hmm.
And this has long been an issue within churches. And I think, again, rightfully so. I'm not saying the dynamic shouldn't be there and everyone should just say whatever they want off the top of their head. I'm not saying that. But
Right.
there there is there has to be sort of a degree in which you can read the room and still have a degree of freedom. And I think as a culture, we're losing our balance in there, partly because of all of the new social medias and the new ways that technology is just disrupting our normal patterns of behavior.
Right. Yeah, because that was going to be my question. Do you like where is this sort of new tyranny coming from, or this feeling of that? Has it always existed and we're just realizing it now, or do you think it is sort of the social media platforms and sort of this more broader universalization of culture that's come in with technology?
I think that's certainly part of it. I think another part of it is the way that social media invites us to propagandize ourselves as a product.
Hmm.
And I think women have much longer had this burden just because of the different ways that men and women relate to each other. But we're all sort of now on a stage and having to promote ourselves as beautiful people, moral people, activists for the right. I mean, the pervasive activism is just wearying. And again, as also so as a member of the clergy, I'm also sort of used to that because and I'm a minister's kid myself. And I didn't grow up in a church where that was tyrannical at all. Growing up in the church I grew up in, I never felt like I had to be someone other than who I was. So I didn't really have to wear a mask. But again, with clergy, we're all sort of used to putting on masks to do different roles, and the roles require that, and so you can do that. But when you have to wear that all the time, especially when now we're in a time and place where we're omnipresent on social media, we're omnipresent on cameras that are watching us. If something dramatic happens, someone can whip out a smartphone and take a video of it and destroy your life. So this difficulty in terms of public and private at the same time, I mean, there are many different elements, and there's public privacy, there's morality, there's the, omnivision, cameras, potential taking our pictures everywhere. So there's tons and tons of stuff that I think are coming all into this mix.
Right. And for me, I think it's interesting. I come from the filmmaking background. So, what got me really interested in sort of filmmaking, the art of that, was just actually watching YouTube vloggers and seeing these people just in their bedrooms putting out their life and people wanting to watch that. And then the more you watch it, realizing, oh, this is like this version of a person. This isn't who they are. And understanding how the camera has a way to change your behavior, sometimes in a good way and sometimes in a bad way. And in a world that's constantly being filmed, constantly looking for opportunities to put our lives out in those formats, it creates this weird dynamic where I think we're always looking for ourselves and our image and how we're looking to other people, but we're also looking out to other people and making sure their image is up too. And it's very odd to me, just the dynamics and the way they play out in our social circles.
And so we've stigmatized so many things. So I'm old enough to remember. Right now, we're always on the hunt for racists. I'm old enough to remember where racists would just tell you they're racist. They just, they're a racist. And that's who they were. And so we put a whole bunch of things in the closet, which now makes it all a little bit more difficult to sort of know where people are standing. And that, I think, bothers and confuses us too. And it goes way beyond just race. We all play coy with each other because we're a little bit scared
Mm.
of, just recently there was a woman who was going to be the new editor of Teen Vogue. And, they scoured her former tweets and found some that were I didn't look at the story carefully. It appears to be an African American woman who said some um, unkind things against Asians. And so boom, out she goes. Okay, she looked like she's in her 20s or 30s, so she's quite young. Shall she never be hired again by what she tweeted when she was 17? This is the kind of society we want?
Right.
I think this is a real problem. And if we don't if and part of the difficulty of this game is that no one sat down and agreed to the rules. We all sort of opted into the rules. And if you want to opt out, you're just going to have a lot of courage and be willing to pay the price if you want to opt out, because there will be a price to pay. And that's where we're at right now.
So the price that's paid to sort of opt out of these rules, that it seems like these unspoken rules that we've all accepted, do you think that it's more of a perceived cost, or do you think that there are genuine things at stake to opt out of the game?
No, this woman, I mean, I would imagine that for her becoming the chief editor of Teen Vogue would have been a major milestone in her career.
Right.
Now she will be, I never would have known who the editor of Teen Folk would be, but I still don't remember her name, but I do remember the story now. And
Right.
that will follow her. And she's a young woman. And to me, this is especially exasperating because all this talk about, we want to prioritize giving women of color high power jobs. Well, here's one who probably was, um, quite competent in many respects, and now she's a pariah and ought to never work again. I mean, what on earth are we doing?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely seems like there's a lot of talk of, trying to prevent hate from other groups, like these marginalized groups, right? And people to do the work. But there's not a lot of real understanding of what that means or how that works, and what counts as more um stigmatizing than something else. And since we came here, I'm going to bring it up because I know you've been watching The Bachelor and you've gotten some flack for that. But I found this season very interesting. I've been watching it with my roommates. I have this weird relationship where I'm half fascinated by the world of reality television and half horrified, because I think there's something to the effect of like, oh wow, how can we manipulate stories and get people to feel things and get people to feel things for other people. Yet there's this whole other end where like these are real people's lives and these are creating narratives and ideologies that we then play out in our own lives. But there's for anybody who hasn't seen it, there's been some issues with The Bachelor. It was the first Black Bachelor, and there was some what people are calling racially insensitive photos that came out for the person he ended up picking. And they have this after the final rose where they have this conversation. And it was really hard to watch and hard to see play out. And there was a lot of dynamics there in trying to have this difficult, hard conversation. And to me, a lot of it didn't feel honest. I'd love to hear your opinion of it and like how you saw those things playing out from your perspective.
I think there are so many layers of watching ourselves, adjusting, watching, adjusting, and watching in that program that I'm not confident any of us have any idea of what's going on there with those people. I really am
Right.
not. And just on the surface of it, the show seems to want to promote the idea that love can conquer all. And love is this mystical, magical, divine thing. Romantic love is a divine thing that if you find your person, that's what they keep saying, your person. And I suspect there's a fair amount of editing that goes on in terms of the producers of the show. These are things you should say. These are things you shouldn't say. I, you know, I started watching the show because other members of my family were interested in the show. And okay, and I want to watch TV with the members of my family. And so I'll usually, because when I pick the show, nobody else wants to watch what I want to watch. So I just hand over the remote and say, I just want to be with you guys. So watch whatever you want and I'll watch it with you. So here you have a guy who comes onto the show, and his father, his father was an African immigrant, and his mother is a white, I suppose, a North American. And again, you get just the little glimpses of the people, and the father and mother had split up, and the Matt James talked in a lot of detail about the pain that he had suffered because of his father abandoning the family and pursuing other women and having other families, and all of this concern about, he wants to pick someone, and when he picks someone, he'll stay with them, and then he eventually doesn't. Spoiler alert. Doesn't get down on one knee and propose to anyone. But all of this talk about how romantic love can overcome. And well, apparently romantic love can't overcome what this woman did in terms of an antebellum party that she took selfies at. And personally, I very much grew up. So I probably should be careful about the details of this story. But
we can edit out anything you don't want. So don't.
Well, why would I say it if we're going to edit it out? So I'll do the editing in my head.
Okay.
So there was someone who came into a significant relational circle that had a beach towel that was a Confederate flag. And I, by virtue of where I grew up, who I grew up, who my parents are, what their work was, where I grew up, I have always found the Confederate flag to just be deeply offensive to me.
Right.
And I remember going and visiting Stone Mountain, Georgia, and thinking, very impressive, these giant stone monuments, but what are they commemorating? This is just such a horrible, painful chapter in American history. And so this person has this Confederate flag for a beach towel. And I said something, and basically everyone just sort of laughed at me in terms of my, my abnormal sensitivities, at least according to their scales. But none of those other people grew up the way I did. So, all right, continue to annoy me. But I didn't break off relationships with any of those people who had this Confederate flag beach towel. And I just, none of the narratives of that show could remain compelling or could remain integral to each other. So this poor woman has to do the work. Okay. Who gets to judge when she has done the work sufficiently?
Right.
What happened to all of this language about, okay, so he didn't propose to her. Okay. So then you find out that she probably, like many people, was not sufficiently aware of the sensitivities of African Americans with respect to American history. You think that's unusual? We live in a country that says, now wants to use the word white supremacy on absolutely everything. And then we're surprised when people are ignorant about insensitive things. I don't know. And then this whole show that wants to sort of propagate an image of the enormous mystical divine power of romantic love stumbles on selfies from a few years ago. And you would have thought, wouldn't they have, it's so amazing in the show how many times you discover that a contestant on the show still has a girlfriend or just broke up with someone right before the show started. And, and it's like, don't these people do research? Come on. But I just found we're just so bad at life and at relationships. And I don't think our culture would have allowed as honest a conversation to happen in that moment on the finale show as should have happened. And maybe nobody should have brought cameras into there at all anyway.
Right.
And there's something deeply sick about, oh, here's someone that, the whole show is set up. I mean, you got 32 women. Guess what? 31 of them are going to be disappointed. You're setting them up so that 2 or 3 of them are going to be seriously hurt emotionally by how you've set this whole thing up. And you play the game so that, don't hold anything back. Cough it all up right here on national TV. Tell us about your bad breakups. Tell us about, it's just like, what are we doing?
Yeah,
What are we doing?
It's definitely this capitalization on like human suffering and human pain, and just the abnormality of being in that situation, and the way that the cameras are. I think it creates a space where you can't genuinely get to know someone in a deep way. There's always going to be something that's shadowed. And I think that was something too. You talk about the show being this sort of propaganda machine of love conquers all. And
Romantic love conquers all.
romantic love conquers all. Yeah. And looking at the history of how successful the marriage rate is on that show would leave questions for most viewers. But I think with the way that this ended, it leaves the question of, should romantic love conquer all? Are there things that shouldn't be, uh, tolerated? And I mean, I don't think that's not in itself a bad question to ask necessarily, but having that conversation in front of millions of people, with cameras and playing this game of status. I mean, most of these women go on to either have free vacations or get a lot of Instagram followers, so then they can have a career outside of the Bachelor, and falling in love was like a bonus, right? I don't think a lot of people necessarily ultimately go for that. And if you're if if the contestants are honest enough, some of them do say those things like, well, I went for status and then ended up finding this person, whatever. And so you always have that question of, are you there for the right reasons? And what does that mean? And how does that play? And when you bring the morality of all things into it and defining that by our own terms, it gets very complicated. And because the show is so much about status and image, I don't think those questions can be answered well, because
No.
there's so much fear of, you know, a mask slipping and being found out as something horrible, that it doesn't leave for the space for good, healthy, productive conversations.
I look at these reality shows, and I think about them in the context of church, because again, churches are these strange places where many of those dynamics run through.
Mm-hmm.
Inevitably, you've got people watching each other in church. I mean, human beings just watch each other in terms of status. It happens in offices, happens in almost any type of situation where people will congregate. Church is infused with a sort of moral status hierarchy, elements of which many of which people will say try to connect to the Bible or to the Christian tradition or whatever religious community tradition they have. But religious communities, in many ways, simply drip with these kinds of dynamics. And so, as a pastor, you get used to watching them carefully towards the end of, okay, honesty is a very valuable thing. Transparency is a very valuable thing, but not everything is appropriately disclosed in the big group. How do you manage those things? Because the goal of the group is is the betterment of all, and betterment in moral categories, betterment on many, many different axes. And in some ways, what's happened in our culture is that everything has sort of become church, because these dynamics are there are more and more places now where we're playing these games. And some of the wisdom that churches have developed over centuries is not found in some of these other places. And all of this with the new entry of, I think, a a new moral ascendant moral system that wants to radically rearrange some of the traditional values. And I'm not saying some of these traditional values don't need to be rearranged, but Jordan Peterson, of course, was one person who sort of walked in and started naming stuff, which it'd be like, someone walking onto The Bachelor and saying, all right, y'all, how many of you, whether or not you find love, are just banking on the fact that you're going to have a 6-figure Instagram following, and that this for you is, setting you up for career advancement for the rest of your life? And by the way, how many of you abnormally good looking human beings frankly can't walk out there and find a few hundred relatively competent potential marriage partners as a function of just being on the first episode of this show? I mean, come on. There's a little bit of honesty here. So, but now we're sort of retinkering with our moral foundations and not really giving much of any thought to, well, how's this really going to play out? Can we really sort of make things up? And of course, Jordan Peterson walks in and says, why is it that women wear lipstick and high heels to the office? What game are they playing? Oh, don't ask a question like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think through asking that question, people assume things and then take it to the place in their mind of, oh, well, he means this, where it's
Right.
like he's asking a question, and the questions, in my opinion, isn't unfair. Now, whether that final product really is just to sexually entice people or not, that's a debate, and we can have that conversation. But I think that we've gotten to the place to even ask the questions becomes a signal to your moral deficiency in a certain aspect. And so then it gets really hard of like, well, what questions can we even ask, and can we ever ask questions to till up the ground to get people to see the holes in what they may or may not believe, whether it's true or not. And that's where I think, for me, the spaces in which we're trying to have the open conversations are not always done in the spirit that's actually helpful to making a change. Um, the other day I actually watched Accidental Courtesy, the Daryl Davis
Oh
documentary.
yeah, yeah,
And that was very interesting.
yeah.
And the thing that I found the most interesting was hearing some of these neo Nazis, these
Real
KKK
white
members,
supremacists
real white
who will tell
supremacists.
you they are.
Well, first of all, they're sitting and talking to a black man who they're calling their friend, which is just, like the cognitive dissonance there is just like sort of like crazy. But then you hear them, and they're making these arguments, and they're talking with confidence and authority and using the Bible or Christianity or different things to construct their arguments. And in one sense, when you're not like you don't want to be associated with like a white supremacist group, you can go, oh, that's ridiculous. But then I look at church and other things and say, well, how often do we do that ourselves? Use the Bible confidently to confirm what we already believe or what we want to believe, and then act like anybody who else who sees it otherwise is different. And you're looking at the some of the things that the white supremacists were saying, and then some of those young guys in the BLM movement. And not to say that that's represents all BLM necessarily, but there were a lot of things that were very similar in this sort of segregation of like we need to keep the black money together, and we don't like we need to find a way to separate and segregate. And it was sort of shocking to hear those side by side and kind of feel like, wow, the spirit of these conversations are so similar, and they hate each other so much, yet there's something similar to that, which is kind of scary.
Well, people should find a good biography of Malcolm X. And the autobiography of Malcolm X is an important book, but it's more like many autobiographies, especially they can sort of autobiographies can get fairly propagandist if you're a fairly high status person. So there's actually a couple of number of years ago, I read a really good biography of Malcolm X, and there's at one point that Malcolm X actually went into negotiations with the Klan because they realized that their black nationalists and the white nationalists sort of had a degree of a vision where they said,
Mm,
okay, well, let's give the black folks this state and let's get the white folks this state and, clear them out from each other. These ideas are not new. They've been around a very long time.
right.
And it's just that a lot of people today don't know a lot of history.
Yeah.
They just look at Malcolm X as he's just sort of Malcolm X had a lot of stages in his life, but he's just sort of a more radical version of Dr. King, right? No, look at the Nation of Islam and look at what, black nationalism, look at the goals they're actually seeking to pursue. Look at how violence worked within that community. Look at why Malcolm X, he was assassinated by the Nation of Islam, the people that he was a leader of.
Mm,
Look at why he got out of that community and why they killed him. I mean, look at the story. It's very well known. It's very well documented, but many of these patterns are already in it. And so the it's not your fault if you're young and you don't know some of these stories, but it's a good idea if you want to play in some of these ballparks to read a little bit of history because a lot of the stuff is played out before.
yeah. I think it's just so hard because there's so much information out there, and when you're looking in your circles, it's easy to get the information that easily fits within your model. And I knew this from growing up sort of in evangelical Christian cultures. When you're testing assumptions, no one gives you a no one gives you a Sam Harris book. They're going to give you some apologetic book that's going to tell you why that's wrong and whatever. There's not and I'm not saying that's good or bad. I think that's a whole different conversation. But I think there is this sort of trend within ourselves. We want to find answers that make sense of the things we already believe. And it's easy to get caught up in that mode of like, okay, well, let me look at the history and dig deep enough to feel confident in the answer I already have, or the answer that seems popular, as opposed to really having some uncertainty to say, well, I don't really know enough about Malcolm X to speak on him.
Yeah.
Or, I don't know what all of these movements are. But we like to talk with confidence, especially when things are very triggering within culture. Like race is something very triggering because nobody wants to look racist. Everybody wants to look loving. And it seems
Why don't we want to look racist?
why don't we want to look racist? Well, I
Because
don't.
we have constructed a degree where being anti-racist gives you status and being a racist reduces your status. Now, I think that's a good thing. I don't think we should be
Yeah.
racist, but we're playing status games with this, and that's normal for human beings. We're highly sensitive to status. Again, that's a big part of Jordan Peterson's thesis, that we're highly sensitive to status. And when we look at a situation, one of the first things, the most salient thing we look at is status. Will I gain status or lose status by what I say or what I do? And we are now suddenly though, then we have the authenticity question, because there's another thing in our set. Oh, we want to be authentic. Okay. So we've got authenticity over here. We've got status over here.
Right.
And that's why we're having difficulty with honesty, because authenticity says, well, I really I have an opinion about that. That's what I feel. Oh, but if I say that opinion, I'm going to lose status. So I shut up. You do this enough, you feel dissonance. You start looking for a community that feels the same way you do. So you can gain status in that community. And well, now you're going to have two communities going like this.
Right. And I definitely agree. I think there's a huge part of it that's the status game. We've created the status game, and that's what we're seeking. I think underneath that, though, there is a pull that a lot of people do think it's immoral to be racist, and therefore they're acting in a way where they don't want to be immoral. Um, and I- is that just because of status or not? I don't know. It probably depends on the person.
Well, how do you
Um,
think morality and status relate?
well, it depends on the communities, probably. But I mean, I think I think it depends on some personalities too, because I think in all the communities that I'm a part of, I don't quite fit the mold in which like I would gain a lot of status if I was always completely honest and authentic in sort of the struggle and the division that I feel in some of the ways that the communities play out. I wouldn't I wouldn't have a lot of status probably. And I guess I don't really mind that necessarily. I've never had a problem being sort of the odd man out in communities. Um but I think that there are times where it's like maybe being told I'm wrong is a good thing. And so I take time to adjust that. But maybe I am just playing the status game too. I'm just a part of it. But I also find myself so disgusted by a lot of the games that come with status where it's like I don't want to be in that game at all. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, I mean, so isn't morality in many ways a status game? It always is. It depends who you're trying to please. And Christians play this game. Christians, okay, we perform for an audience of one. And I mean, that's part of the idea in Christianity. And so
Right.
we gain status with God by being moral. And that's a true thing. Christianity also begins to play around with these status games too. Because
Right.
on one hand, it says, you read the end of the book of Deuteronomy, fulfill the covenant and God will bless you. Sounds like straightforward karma. And then you've got the book of Job where he's the best man in the world and he suffers. And so the book of Job basically says, it's not quite so simple as karma. And then you get to Jesus, who's the best man in the world, and he suffers, and he says, follow me, and you know, you will please God. I am the way to the Father. And yet at the same time, he goes down to the bottom and he raises up people. I was just preaching this Sunday on Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is in Jericho. He has a reputation for being highly immoral because he is completely sold out to the imperialist Romans and all the destruction that they are doing in the community. And Jesus elevates his status by going to his house. And in kind, then Zacchaeus, as a response to this, then says he's going to, anybody he robbed, he's going to give them 4 times as much as he took from them, which is double the Mosaic law. And so you find all of this stuff going on, and humans can actually track this, which is amazing. So, but that's what we're playing in. And I think to go back to the social media thing, part of what's so disorienting for us is that, again, you go back to this Dunbar number that say really you get maybe 3 really tight relationships, maybe a dozen close friendships, and really a personal relationship with between 100 and 200 people, let's say, depending on how introverted or extroverted you are. Now on social media, we are supposed to have thousands of relationships.
Hmm.
We've just multiplied all of this complexity exponentially, and we still have to play all of these moral status games, all of these other status games, and we're sort of to the edge of This doesn't really work for human beings, but we're
Yeah.
not going to go away from it.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I feel like status and morality have this weird dynamic where it's like if you're just being moral for a status claim, that then becomes immoral because you're not doing it in the right spirit. And then there's the virtue signaling and the accusations of, oh, you're a bad faith actor, whatever. And so now it becomes this real struggle to figure out how to even operate within those things of like, how do we not just sit and climb the status ladder and do good things for that, but also realizing that this sort of status mechanism is not in itself a terrible thing to help create some norms in society.
It's very valuable. But Jesus so completely complicates these things because he says things like, the greatest among you must be the slave of all.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of stop and think, what do you mean by that? His disciples are arguing and he pulls this boy over to the table. Well, why is this boy in the room? The boy's in the room because he's probably running dishes back and forth. He's probably the son of the people that they rented the room from, and says, the greatest among you must be like that kid standing in the corner. And of course, Jesus strips down and washes their feet. And then Peter says, well, wash all of me. And Jesus is like, you get the point, So no, you're exactly right. This is tremendously complicated. Part of because we're always watching each other. And so it's like, well, are you doing this to gain status with me? Because if you gain status with me, then you will put me in your debt. And then if you put me in your debt, you can ask for things from me. And it just keeps getting deeper. And in fact, this is a point I like to make in my videos. We have, I think every culture is always in the midst of some kind of cultural struggle to work things out. And in our case, both sides are so deeply expressive of Christianity that we're in the middle of a Christian culture war. Because if let's say liberation is a very big theme in Christianity. And so you got gay liberation and women's liberation and black liberation. Those are
Right.
very deep themes in Christianity. And these come from Christianity and regard for the oppressed. The other side, you've got, all other values of Christian morality in terms of self-sacrifice and surrender. So you've got sacrifice on one hand and you've got liberation on the other hand. How do you have sacrifice and liberation actually work together? That's what we're working on. It's really hard. And
Right.
so we've got all the status games at the same time. And so it would be nice if we could say, okay, we've got sacrifice versus liberation. I'm going to be the slave of Christ and he's going to set me free. Well, how am I set free if I'm still his slave? And these are very hard things to figure out. And we're not going to make progress unless we can sort of back down, lower the tension level and say, okay, let's talk about this.
Yeah. So going back to your project a little bit, you talk to a lot of atheists, agnostics, non-Christians, deconstructors. How is that in the conversations you've had with all of those different groups of people helped you in sort of navigating this tension of like the status and the authenticity and the morality?
Most people I talk to are close enough, usually within the English speaking world, our English speaking, deeply Christianized culture. What that means is that as a pastor, it's easy for me to say most of the people who identify as Christians are not as Christian as they should be. Pastors say that all the time. That's the premise of our job. Many of the people who don't identify as Christians are more Christian than they imagine they are.
Mm-hmm.
And by this point, 2,000 years later, our value hierarchies have been so deeply formed by Christianity that, as many others, Rene Girard said it very eloquently, anti-Christians use Christianity against Christians. That's what they're doing when they look in the Bible and they say, God doesn't seem to be very nice. That's he's basically using a Christian moral value system against some of the things that they find in the Bible. And so they're but that then creates a more interesting irony because they say, I can't believe in this God because I don't believe in his morality. Implicit in that is I'm more moral than this God and I'm going to sit in judgment over him. Okay. Now, how are you going to live out that morality? Because you might assume you're more moral than that Old Testament God, but how moral are you really? And now suddenly we're in the morass of our own morality judgments. So I I also I also think that on one hand, I just listened to Gavin Ashenden, I think that's his name. He's a very interesting guy. He's now Roman Catholic clergy in the UK. He was Anglican. Very interesting guy. I've looked into him a little bit because he did this commentary on Peterson and Peugeot's conversation. But when I listened to him talk, I heard for the most part all of the old ways of phrasing what Christianity is. And what happens in language is that we build up resistances to certain formulations. They become keywords, they become standard phrases, and they no longer work. And what I mean by that is that they all looked like mapped territory for both sides of the conversation, and we just sort of dismiss them. One of the amazing things about Jesus is that he said stuff which seems to be highly resistant to being mapped and dismissed. He said things in a certain way that the more you dig into them, you're looking at something and you're saying, I can't quite map this.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sticks in us and it continues to bother us. And so part of the reason I keep talking to both sides is I want to look for ways to talk more like Jesus. And the only way I know if I'm doing it right is to say things to people and see how they respond.
Right.
And so that's it's and I'll just put my cards on the table. I want people to become Christians, but I want Christians to become more Christian and I want people who don't identify as Christian to also become more Christian. That's my agenda, but it's really hard to do. Now, I also know that I'm not in charge of them. I don't have any power of coercion at all. And a lot of Christians try to play coercive games and conversations, but we're so used to being coerced and propagandized. You got to be really subtle to do it now. So I think a lot of Christians should stop their silly power games in terms of bullying and cornering people because that doesn't work. You're better off just actually talking to them and being honest with them and trying out new ways of articulating and doing what Jesus did. And then actually, maybe they might not change their self definition, but you might give them something to think about that whether or not they begin identifying as a Christian, some of those Christians' ideas might just begin to colonize their thinking and their lives because they've seen the power and the beauty of what I'm taking from Jesus. So that's my game, essentially.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting. Growing up in evangelical cultures and even appreciating a lot of the things that they stand for, there was always sort of this mode of like, we've got to change people's minds. And I've struggled with that in the last years of like, is it right to change people's minds? And it's like, well, I don't think it's wrong to change people's minds, especially if you believe something's true and it's good. I think there are bad ways to go about changing people's minds. But I think the more important thing than trying to change other people's minds, in the way I see it now, is being able to change my own mind first. Like, if I'm unwilling to change my own mind and make sure that I'm being critical in myself and the things that I'm thinking and believing, I'm never going to be effective in changing somebody else's mind if that's the path I choose to go to. And I don't think I think there's just sort of this thing bred within the culture war and in the political and the religious that we got to change people's minds about everything. It's like, well, why should I change people's minds about things I don't know that well? And I that's where I kind of get dangerous. It's not about going out and asking the questions and trying to change people's minds. It's like, how well do we know the things we're trying to change people's minds on? And are we asking the right questions of ourselves before we go out and propagate something we haven't thought thoroughly? And so there's this spirit in which I guess I struggle with in some of these spaces where it's like on either side, the sort of apologetic evangelical culture, or even sort of this deconstruction of like trying to breed out questions where it becomes this confidence and certainty, and it leaves no room to ask questions and explore people and like build relationships first. It's often, let's build relationships to change their mind. It's like, well, why don't we just
Yeah.
build relationships to know people and understand them, maybe change our minds and maybe change theirs, and together work to change each other for the better. I don't know. And that's why I think I just love seeing what you're doing and being part of the Bridges of Meaning community, because there's so many people from different places, and we're not all uh, polished or nice all the time. And I don't even think that we should be. Like, I think there's too much pressure of like trying to be nice all the time. But um, there's a spirit in which like we're community first. We're learning people's stories. We're knowing people to then explore ideas and do that better. And there creates a level of trust, and we can sense people out a little bit and understand them from the pattern of getting to know them. And it's been a whole different experience of exploring, the big questions coming from that frame than some of these more um I don't want to say elementary, but like simpler packages that I was given before to kind of get people out of their comfort zone and share Jesus.
I think there's an implicit agreement in any conversation and relationship that we will both open each other up to the influence of the other, open ourselves up to the influence of the other. And I think that's fair and that's right. And you see that in Jesus. I mean, people don't like the story of Jesus and the Canaanite or Syrophoenician woman
Mm-hmm.
because Jesus seems to not want to be bothered by her. And then he says, "Hey, I'm sent to the children of Israel. It's not right that the dogs eat the children's food." And I was like, "Oh, Jesus, how could you say that?" And the woman stands her ground and says, "Hey, but even the little dogs get the snacks." And Jesus says, "Wow, you've got faith. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna release your daughter from that demon." And the same thing happens with the blind man when, again, I just preached on Jesus going into Jericho. The blind man won't be shut up. And everybody, the people in the town are like, should have cleaned off the streets before Jesus comes. He's got to see our mess. And so often in the Gospels, when people are dogged with Jesus, Jesus will express surprise. And one might think, surprising the Son of God might be a really peculiar challenge. So go for it. But you find that in the Bible all the time, where God enters into real dialogue and real community with people. I mean, look at his conversation with Abraham in, in Genesis 18. And I find so often people try to be holier than the Bible because, oh, I had said it myself. I said God opens himself up to our influence, and then people kind of step. Well, how did And I understand philosophically and theologically why there's pushback on something like that,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really hard not to read God's conversation with Abraham in Genesis 18 and think, God, call it accommodation if you want to, but even when you call it accommodation, then it seems inauthentic. The whole purpose of prayer, not the whole purpose, at least part of the purpose of prayer, is that God opens himself up to our influence. And when Jesus says to his disciples, you know, I now call you my friends. That's what he's saying. I'm opening myself up to your influence. The prayer of the righteous man availeth much. Why? Because he is friends with God, and God is opened up to his influence. And so Christians are more holy that we can't be opened up to the influences of others. Let's not be so. It also takes, there's so many ironies in this. It also takes a person who is very secure to be able to open themselves up to another, because they say, I will not lose myself in opening myself up to you. And
Mhm.
it's often the person who is insecure says, I can't open myself up to anyone, or I might lose myself. Oh, okay. Well, tough to be you.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and I think you see it play out in churches often, where the Bible becomes this moral tale that tells us exactly how to act and the ways to play out. And there's definitely times in the Bible you see these patriarchs or these highlighted characters acting in ways that are very foreign to us, often very immoral, and it's easier to go. It's easy to go, oh, how stupid are they? Oh, the Israelites. They're in the wilderness for 40 years and they can't figure it out to trust God. He's doing all these things. Yet, like when you start to reflect it on yourself and realize, oh, how often do I do that? In a different way. And how often are these patterns played out in my own life in different ways? And maybe I didn't murder a guy, but how am I justifying my own sort of evil that I'm perpetrating out in the world? And I think the more you read that book, the more you start to question your own authenticity and reality. And it's like, there's a truth to the fact that if you were completely honest and completely authentic, you would lose a lot of status because there's a lot of things we think about other people or believe that are just awful. And nobody wants to admit that.
No. But
And
but yet we know it. And you read like the books that Google or OK Cupid recent, not a while ago did a video, everyone's a little racist. Everyone's a little, sexist.
okay,
And
Cupid did a video like that.
yeah, everyone's a little racist. Yeah. Because, they just looked at the algorithm and it's like, well, I'm willing to go out with anybody. Really? No, you've got a value hierarchy and you're playing that. And no, and part of what I love about the Bible, I mean, the Bible very much is a book that is all about morality, but it is so subtle. One of my favorite examples is in the book of Numbers. Israel is being seduced by Moabite women,
Yeah.
and Phinehas takes a spear and puts it through an Israelite lad and a Moabite girl that while they're in the act, and that becomes this archetypal story of zeal. But then you have the book of Ruth, where you've got that background in Numbers, but then in the book of Ruth, Ruth is a hero, and she's a
Right.
Moabite woman. And she comes in and she saves Israel and becomes, the ancestor to David and Christ. And the Bible uses that subtlety and nuance, and you could read the story in Numbers and say, we should stick to our own kind. Or you could read the story in Ruth and say, you should lay around on the threshing floor trying to snare a, high status Israelite guy. Is that the story? So, it's there. No, it's shot with morality, but it's so carefully woven. And to me, so much, we do so much bad Bible reading that we should probably do a little bit more and become better readers of it.
Yeah. No, and I think it's so hard to be good at it. It's this book that was written how many thousands of years ago in a different language, at a different time, in a different culture. And there's such the temptation to take my Western frame, plug it in, use that to see this whole book. But it's just doing a disservice to really understanding the full context of it. And it's wild, you know? But I think the more that I've read the Bible, the more I've started to be more questioning of myself, where it's like, I think maybe there's something wrong in the way that I'm reading this, or something I'm missing, as opposed to it being like the problem. And not that I don't struggle with it still. There are definitely things like that Moabite story where they're like putting the spear through the people. I read that this year, and that was a story that stuck out. I'm like, what is going on? I'm so confused, and I have no context to where to put this. And but yeah, I just sort of like suspend my judgment and go, okay, there was probably something I'm missing. And it's I just finished reading Ruth, so hearing that and those things together, it's like, yeah, wait, that doesn't make any sense.
Right, right.
How does this come together? That's so interesting.
And life is like that. And you can learn wisdom and morality from narrative in that way and say, oh, okay. Let's say you pick a spouse of a different religion or a different culture. There's going to be some issues. There just simply are. But at the same time, um, you know, life is very big and complex with respect to a lot of things. And so I yeah, I as a preacher, I enjoy teaching the Bible to hopefully help people see the complexities of it, and not, and it's all, I mean, this goes all the way. I often say, there's always the antithetical, which means the yes no. That doesn't go away when you also have the nuance, because they actually play together with
Yeah.
each other. Sometimes you need the yes no. Jesus draws hard lines sometimes, and you're like, oh, those hard lines. And other times he can be enormously generous and giving. But that is how the world is. There are really hard lines sometimes, and they have to be obeyed and respected. But there are sometimes exceptions too. And you don't understand exceptions if you don't have rules. And if you only have exceptions, you don't have rules, and you need rules. So life is like that.
Yeah.
And so God is both incredibly demanding, he's a holy God, and he's enormously generous. And those two things we have a tremendous amount of difficulty squaring.
Yeah.
He's incredibly demanding, absolute holiness, and astounding mercy. So holy, we think that's, we can never measure up. And then so merciful, we think that's not responsible.
Yeah.
That's what we think.
Yeah. It feels like a paradox.
Yeah, well, but they're both true, and we know they're true. And the question is, when and how are they applied? And you see this in the life of Moses. Moses first strikes the rock. God says, strike the rock and the water will come. He strikes the rock and the water comes. And then talk to the rock and the water will come. And he strikes it instead. Ah, no more promised land for you. and we feel for Moses. And I think we should. But at the same time, but what we implicitly do is make ourselves then judge. And the Bible keeps saying, you got to be real careful with that, because if you're the judge, you really want that burden to bear.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're running close to an hour, but I wanted to ask one more question before we close it down.
Sure.
So, through all these conversations and all of these um, people you've been able to engage, what is the thing that you have learned the most in the way that you bring that into the way you live as a pastor?
It's the whole process has been deeply affirming for me. I mean, it is certainly wonderful and nice to have a bigger audience than what I have here at Little Livingstone's Church. But at the same time, kind of the opposite is there too, that I value the face to face. And there is something about in real life community that can never really be copied online. And
Yeah.
so it's sort of both and for me. In some ways, what I do online, who I am online is who I've always been. It's just more people know about me now, which maybe is a good thing. Maybe 5 years from now I'll take it all off the air. Who knows? But
Go off the grid.
go off the grid.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't. I think that'd be impossible at this point. There's too much stuff out there. But I don't know. I don't know. I I feel like I need to apologize. I think I've probably been your worst guest.
No, no. No, I've enjoyed the conversation, but I'm a Bible nerd. So when you start talking about all of these stories, and in fact, all of the ones you brought up have been all of these repeated like stories that keep coming up in my life lately, where
Hmm.
it's just like that leave the questions where I'm like, I can't escape them. I feel like I need to figure these out. So it's been very helpful for me. And I think the way that you talk about God and culture and status and how all of those things come together and the way that you allow people to have real conversations and say the things that maybe they shouldn't say or definitely shouldn't say to a pastor. It's refreshing, and I think it, to me, being a consumer of those things, it helps people realize, oh, these questions that I have, I'm not the only one. And there's a whole community of people trying to work through those things too. And there are places for people who don't want to lose religion, who see a value to it, but who want to ask the hard, honest questions. There's places for people to go. So I think what you're doing is like very powerful.
Well, thank you. I I don't want people to lose religion because in my experience, you never really do. What
Right.
they do is that they just start making stuff up, or they pick up folk religions, and they're just not they're just not as they just don't work as well,
Mhm.
because established religious traditions have been it's sort of like there's a lot of people out there who have a lot of good wisdom and anecdotal experience about your body. Oh, do this or do that. But when you go to a trained medical doctor, they've at least had a certain degree of discipline that's been built into the system.
Right.
And it doesn't mean it's always right. It doesn't mean it gets everything right. And it doesn't mean it won't stumble and fail. But over the course of time, it's your better bet.
Yeah.
And to me, the most gratifying thing of this whole crazy 3 years that I've been doing this are people like you, Cassidy, because I see you as, you know, trying to make this world better with these crazy tools that we have, and having honest conversations with people and asking difficult questions and being brave enough to risk a little bit of exposure um and perhaps, I don't know, condemnation in light ways for something good. So I I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, and I want to see you succeed in it, and I want to see you grow in wisdom from it, because I'm in my 50s now, and my father died in his 70s. So, uh, I don't, who knows how many more years I have in this world. But once you hit your 50s, you really should sort of turn to say, okay, what legacy can I leave behind? And to the degree that I can help you and how many others like you, to me, that's most gratifying.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I probably should be more careful with the things I say and what I do, because I can definitely be hot-headed, but I'm learning to be better. But I'm just grateful for the space that I found in new media where these things are happening, because I do think that I've gained a lot from it, but I see a lot of people gaining things as well, and growing to be more honest and real and find things in a fuller way, which I think can only be helpful. So thank you for participating in that and kind of getting me into this world. And I'm excited to see how it all continues. So, but thanks for talking with me. I appreciate it.
I'm always happy to talk with you, Cassidy. You know that.
Thank you so much for listening. As always, I will close with the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference.